speaking up for the energy sector. By day, he's a Calgary Real Estate Agent, a successful one. By every other minute of the day, he is one of, if not the loudest cheerleaders of the energy sector in Canada. Cody Battershill says the energy sector was and still is the foundation of a strong economy in Alberta, and it is the economic backbone of the country. Battershill identified early on a disturbing trend in other parts of Canada. That being that the average person had no direct relationship with the energy sector, and they were being swayed by mega campaigns to turn the world off of Alberta Oil. Battershill decided to speak up. He represents a group of people who are proud Albertans and proud Canadians. Battershill is convinced he can help others realize the important contribution the energy sector makes in our lives and in the Canadian economy. Cody Battershill, thank you for joining me on this Conversations That Matter series, Western Alienation. I first met you about 10 years ago when you were worried we would find ourselves in this very place that we're in right now, that being where the rest of Canada lost sight of the enormous contribution Alberta makes to the Canadian economy. From your perspective, what happened that proved your prescient concern to be correct?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to sit with you again today here, and it's a very important topic. I mean, across Canada, we have this abundance of natural resources, and of that, energy, oil and gas, as well as hydroelectricity, uranium for nuclear power generation, wind and solar. These are all very important parts of our energy mix. And oil and gas has most years over the last couple decades been our number one export. This is a major economic driver of our country. Hundreds of thousands of families from across the country, 500,000 Canadians, thousands of businesses, and hundreds of communities depending on our oil and gas sector. And this is an oil and gas sector that has risen to meet the challenge of climate change. It's rising to meet the challenge of ESG metrics and reporting. We are leading the world in innovation and clean technology, and yet there continues to be a disconnect, a large disconnect it seems. And many people are playing politics, if you will. Many people are using these fear-driven, emotionally charged sound bites that are, and it's devoid of science. It's devoid of a factual understanding of where we're at on the environment and how critical this industry is to the national economy. It's not just Alberta, it's not just BC or Saskatchewan or offshore, Newfoundland. This is the entire country that does benefit. And there is a large disconnect. We need to continue building bridges. We need to work together now more than ever. We need to think about this as Team Canada and as a unifying opportunity to put people back to work, to create revenues for government, and to get our responsibly produced energy to the world, produced with the highest standards for the environment, for social and for governance metrics.
You are committed to sharing this message, even though it's not your day job. What was it that prompted you to speak up?
I have been doing this for many years now, and it was 2010. Crazy when I think about it, it's been a decade. I was in Vancouver, I was on Robson Street, and I was walking by Lush Cosmetics, and I saw their Stop the Tar Sands campaign. And looking at how important the resource sector is to the country, the energy sector in Alberta and elsewhere, and also the disinformation, the intentional, misleading, fictional, and inaccurate statements that are leveled without any care for what's real and what's true. It just really, to be honest, it really bothered me. It pissed me off, to be honest, because these are real Canadians. These are real families that depend on our resource sector, that depend on the spin-off from our resource sector. And the Lush Cosmetics campaign really lit a fire under me. As a realtor, I know firsthand the good and the bad stories, the experiences, the livelihoods that have been impacted positively by our energy sector, our resource sector, and also negatively due to a lack of pipelines, due to investment leaving Canada for other jurisdictions, companies relocating offices and headquarters. And ultimately, throughout this entire time, we have seen oil demand continue to grow, investment in oil around the world continue to grow, and projects delayed, canceled, and stifled at home. And that's not a win for the environment. It's not a win for our families. And I really still feel quite strongly that a balanced, informed, and positive message will continue to resonate. We see more and more people across the country that consistently polling shows that people want to support our local industry, and people are really, I think, starting to understand more about what happens if we don't support our local industry. Who benefits, and that's other producers with weaker standards. And the Indigenous voice has also been critical. A majority of the Indigenous communities on these major pipeline projects, most recently Coastal GasLink for LNG Canada, as well as Trans Mountain, really do support these projects. And we need to get back to balance. We do live in a democracy, and it should be sort of a democratic principle in terms of how many of these communities, how many Canadians are supportive, and we can't let a very vocal, I believe it to be a small but very loud minority of these groups that are really responsible for most or much of the misleading narrative continue to go unchallenged, because people are basing their opinions on disinformation.
You did predict the greater Canadian public and politicians in many regions of the country would discount Alberta resources, and investment in the province would drop as a result. And you were right. Now, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, we hear outgoing Green Party leader Elizabeth May and Bloc Québécois Party leader Yves-François Blanchet urging Ottawa to deny emergency funding to the energy sector because, in their words, oil is dead, so let the sector die.
Yeah, and I've engaged with Elizabeth May, for example, on Twitter, and Canada Action, we are nonpartisan. This is about people, and this is about good policies, but it's not about political parties or political ideologies or anything like that. It is, though, very concerning that you do have people in a position where they can get a lot of coverage from the media. That's disseminated to the public at large, and there's often there's rampant misunderstanding or misinformation. There's inaccurate and out of context information that's being delivered, and people are going for these quick hit headlines, and they're not thinking about the Canadians, our neighbors, our family, our friends, the supply chain, the manufacturing, the Indigenous communities that stand to win or lose if we do or do not support our energy sector. And also, ultimately, who benefits when we don't seize that opportunity. Most recently, right now, COVID-19, we've seen the country really come together. We've seen provinces and the federal government really come together. We've seen Canadians from all walks of life. And again, thank you to everyone who's out there, putting themselves out there, working on the front line, keeping our water supply clean, keeping our garbage collected, keeping the lights on in our homes, keeping our cell phones and our internet working, getting food from farm to table, and everything else that's going on to keep our society, our modern society, functioning. That society is completely dependent upon natural resources. Thank you to our resource workers, our oil and gas workers, our forestry workers. Where does toilet paper come from? How do we build things? It's mining and wood and energy. So, we need to understand, I think, moving forward, we've come together as a country, this real Team Canada approach. And I think it's really disappointing to have people that can get media like the two political leaders this week really attacking other Canadians. We have a crisis with COVID. We've had a crisis of not building pipelines, selling the cheapest oil in the world, despite the fact we have the best ESG rankings environment, social, and governance rankings of the world's top 10 oil exporters. And for people that care about these rankings, people that say they care about people, climate, planet, social progress, good governance, it's completely insane to say one thing and do another. And by continuing to spread a misleading narrative that oil is dead, I mean, up until this year, oil demand has been growing every year for the last 10 years. And forecasts are we're going to be 2040 or 2050. And even when we have all electric vehicles, it's been said oil demand's still going to be more than 85, 90 million barrels a day. In the best scenarios from the IEA, you've got oil demand still at 70, 75 million barrels in 15 to 25 years. And so we have to again ask ourselves, and I think we should be the last producer out of the pool because this industry supports Canadians, fellow people like us that work in different industries and do different things, that are involved, whether they're an engineer or whether they're a welder or they're driving a truck or they own a restaurant. There's so many people impacted positively by our resource sector, and we have the highest standards, and we're always trying to get better, and that's been lost. People don't want to talk about the present day progress that's been made in the Canadian energy sector. And I think the audacity of these political leaders, it's really disappointing that they're trying to tear people apart, especially during COVID. And, we stopped producing, or we stopped sending, Quebec is now getting about half their oil from Western Canada because of the Line 9 pipeline reversal. So there's an example. We build a pipeline, we're going to get Canadian oil to Quebec. Irving is now talking about taking Canadian oil from Burnaby through the Panama Canal. If only we had built Energy East. And $125 billion of oil imports to the country over the last 7-8 years. Support Canadian families, buy the oil and gas produced to the highest environmental standards, recycle that prosperity within our economy, and work together. We need to work together. And this rhetoric from these leaders this week, I actually think it's despicable, tearing people apart.
When Teck canceled the Frontier Mine project, what was your reaction? And what does it say about the mindset of politicians and regulators when it comes to understanding the nature of investment in the energy sector and the contribution of the oil and gas industry to the Canadian economy?
Teck was disappointing. And I think there was, again, a bit of that disconnect between other parts of the country. We were hearing in the news that there was MPs in different parts of the country that don't understand, didn't have the facts, and were being really pressured by some of these groups, again, that are omitting the reality of what happens when they get their way. And so on Teck, the positive on Teck was that you had every single Indigenous community surrounding the project that supported the project. The negative on Teck was that it didn't, Teck did not feel like they had a chance. They didn't feel like it was going to get approved, even though they had jumped through every hoop over almost a 10-year period. And that's a really damning verdict on Canadian competitiveness. We need to have certainty. If a company comes in and checks the boxes and works with communities and consults with Indigenous and gets Indigenous participation, not after the fact, but before and during, and if they can do everything that's asked of them, they should have certainty that they will be able to proceed should they choose to. That is an environment where we can attract investment, and that investment creates jobs, and it creates spin-off, and it creates taxation and revenues for government that we can use to fund our quality of life. And we have seen, it's not just Teck, over the last several years, we've seen Kinder Morgan leave. We saw Statoil. Statoil operates all over the world, and the one asset at the time that they were selling was Alberta, even though we've been the only top oil supplier to the United States with carbon pricing since 2007. There's again this disconnect between what people say, what protest groups, anti-pipeline groups say they care about, and the facts and the science of what Alberta's been doing, what Canada's been doing. And so I think going forward, the real takeaways from tech is we have a crisis of competitiveness. And it's not just in energy, it's in the entire economy. It's the time it takes to get a building permit, it's investment in other industries, it's investment in the resource sector. It's regulatory red tape, and there's other things that a lot of the business councils are talking about, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, etc. The other takeaway, the real positive takeaway, I think, was the Indigenous participation, the Indigenous voice speaking up in support of having been partners with tech on this project. And I hope that all industries, especially in the resource sector, will see that blueprint for success. Despite the fact the project is on hold and was withdrawn, will see that that's the blueprint for success going forward, is all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, young and old, labor and non-labor, from all parts and all walks of life in our great country, working together. We have to work together if we're going to support families, whether they're in New Brunswick or British Columbia or the Northwest Territories or Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, Quebec. The entire country has an opportunity to benefit, and we are all going to see increased quality of life, increased pride in our overall outlook, and in the way, and knowing that other Canadians are prospering. Also, we're going to have to tackle our debt problem that we have, provinces and federally, and so we are going to need a blueprint coming out of this current crisis, both competitiveness, COVID, and also for the economy, kickstart the economy again.
You are a proud Canadian. You are not a separatist, yet you know that the alienation sentiment is rising. Do you believe the nature of the relationship with other regions in Canada can be repaired?
I think it can be repaired. I think we need to continue trying to repair it. I think that we can continue telling our story. We can never stop telling our story. We have to understand that for forever, there was no effort to advocate and to educate and to inform and work with other provinces so that they could understand the opportunities for them, and they could understand just how important the energy and the oil and gas and the resource sector is to the entire country's prosperity. And there was a vacuum, there's a void of information. And around the time of Lush Cosmetics in 2010, when I was in Vancouver, we saw the campaign against Keystone XL start. And it has just picked up steam, and it has kept rolling along ever since. And they take credit for essentially everything bad that's happened. They brag and they gloat, and I think it's despicable, but they brag and they gloat about everything bad that's happened to Canadian families and Canadian workers, with no mention of who's benefiting, the other oil and gas producers that have benefited from this action. So I think now we have Canadians in other provinces more than ever that understand how important the energy sector is. There's people in other provinces, whether they're Indigenous or they're unionized, their manufacturing, their supply chain, or they're flying in and working in the energy industry. I think more people than ever now understand, but we got to keep that momentum going. And I think a positive message, building bridges and bringing people together is the right route. And I think it would be I think it would be really hard for the country if we were to shut down our energy sector, or if we were to see another crisis of potentially splitting up the country. I think that's I think it could be horrible. We got to keep trying to bring people together.
So you're saying we'll be hearing you for a long time yet?
Yeah, I mean, I'm fired up, and I think we've seen a lot of success. I mean, we can sit around and talk about the coulda beens, but at the end of the day, the Trans Mountain expansion is under construction right now as we speak. I feel really good about that. I feel really good that we're going to expand that capacity. It's got major Indigenous support. It's been through the ringer, and it's persevered. And I do give the federal government full credit for buying that project and advancing that project. LNG Canada is a major opportunity for us to get the cleanest natural gas on earth with the shortest shipping times to Asia, which is where demand is going to be growing massively, both for oil and gas over the decades to come. And we have a much shorter shipping times. We'll have much lower emissions, also powered by hydroelectric opportunities. And there are other bright spots, and we have to get back to that mentality. We are a nation of builders. We can work together, and our resource sector is a major pillar of our national prosperity.
When you look at the work of Alberta Innovates, in particular the work on medical-grade plastics that are a great use of bitumen, and we also look to the construction of propane dehydrogenation refineries in Alberta to use fossil fuels to produce a reliable source of polymer-grade propylene for use in plastics of all kinds, what does this say to you about the determination of the energy sector?
The determination of entrepreneurs and of the hardworking women and men that make up this industry so that they can feed their families it never ceases to amaze me. You mentioned a couple of great examples, and when we even pull back and we look a little bit broader, we sent up a satellite to monitor emissions. Right? We've got the Carbon X Prize. We had this Carbon X Prize trying to really spur the innovation of what are we going to use, what else can we use from these byproducts and from carbon for that future potential. There's companies trying to take titanium, really small amounts of titanium out of other processes, and then that might be you could sell that or use it in electric vehicles. And there's other uses. We've got Canada's a leader in carbon capture and storage in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Something like 20% of the world's major commercialized projects are in this country, and we're a leader in that knowledge and that know-how. The first wind farm was in Alberta in 1993, and Alberta, Canada's 9th in the world for installed wind capacity. Hydroelectricity, energy, we export our energy, our oil and gas to the United States. We also are a major exporter of electricity, a lot of that hydroelectricity. And so, I think there's a lot of similarities, more than people would even recognize, between Quebec and Alberta in that regard. And, the list of innovation is endless. The oil and gas industry, I'm really proud of this. The oil and gas industry is Canada's largest spender on clean technology and environmental protection.
Do you find it ironic that oil sands bitumen is rich in lithium and is considerably better for the environment than lithium mining?
There's so many opportunities. Mining, I think as the world does see more and more electric vehicles, more batteries for phones and for everything else, we want to develop our own industry if we can in the rare earth metals, right? And working with the United States on that so that we're not, there's no supply chain risk from overseas. And again, in the mining sector, in the uranium sector, we have a major potash and fertilizer and then uranium resource, and getting that to the world for no emission power generation and also in terms of agriculture usage is a huge opportunity. We have all of these opportunities literally under our feet, and it's our ingenuity that has even unlocked a lot of this. The oil sands, people said, you go back 30 years, 20 years even. 2000, there was no steam-assisted gravity drainage projects that were commercial and operating. 2001 was the first, and now here we are. More than 50% of the production is drilled. It's produced in place, and that's more than half the production, 80% of the reserves, and 97% of the land. Another example, when you just show a zoomed-in shot of a mine, and you don't want to talk about reclamation or the other technologies there, it's not the whole story. We got to have a balanced conversation, look at the whole story, the entire landscape, and how Canadians producing our resources with our standards, our regulations, and our innovation, we are a positive force of good in the world. Leaders in resource governance, as another example, if we could export those standards, that technology, those environmental protections, the world would be a much, much, much better place in many different regards. So I think we have a lot of opportunity ahead. We got to come together. We got to live in that positive mindset. We can't take pot shots at each other. And I think we need to hold people accountable, whether it's these political leaders that are not necessarily informed about what they're talking about. And it's great to see the McMurray Métis invite those leaders to come and do a tour. I did a tour last year with the mayor of Victoria. It was phenomenal. Lisa Helps is a wonderful person. It was so nice to spend the day with her. And we came out of that tour with a lot of new understanding, mutual respect for some different perspectives and opinions on things, but it was so informative. And the mayor even said that a lot of what she had learned or thought previous was driven by a lot of social media, and coming and seeing things in person, meeting the workers, meeting some of the Indigenous contractors at site, seeing how things are done. And that's really a huge part of the future for the Canadian energy and for the oil sands specifically, is looking at that steam-assisted gravity drainage, again, unlocked our ingenuity, our innovation from the mid-'80s onwards. So I think we do have a bright future ahead, but we got to come together, we got to work together, and we got to be supportive of one another.
Cody, thanks for joining me, and I'm happy to know that you remain committed to Canada.
All of Canada, all of our resources, oil and gas, renewables, our mining, our forestry, our ag, everyone, all families across the country. And the spinoff from that, it's a pillar of our national economy. We're a trading nation, we're an exporting nation, we're a resource nation, and we have a lot of other great industries. We should support all of our industries, and I think we do have a bright future ahead. So thank you so much for having me.